Hello and welcome to another episode of Demon Souls Dissected. This marks the first episode after the release of the PlayStation 5 remake, and leading up to its release, I wasn't entirely sure what it would mean for this series. Thankfully, because of how similar the remake is to the original, there's no need to diverge the series for the two different versions. For those who may be unaware, the Demon Souls remake isn't totally rebuilt from scratch. Yes, it is running on a different engine, but they still copied or ported a whole bunch of code and parameters into their new engine. Enemy hit points, damage and defense calculations, world tendency events, enemy placement and AI, a lot of this stuff is identical. There are even instances of the games sharing some bugs, because they really are that similar.
It's still there! It's still there! It's so good!
I find this really cool, and it makes the underlying experience extremely accurate to the original in a lot of ways. So moving forward, I'll be sure to point out if anything differs between the two versions. Otherwise, most of what I talk about will apply to both. Speaking of which, I might as well quickly bring us up to speed here. My first episode was about a mechanic where pushing a bunch of depraved ones into the valley can spawn up to 10 extra items in the Leechmonger's lair. This is still true for the remake, and it works just the same, but there are a couple small things to look out for. Ragdoll corpses are now much harder to push, and enemies killed with magic have their corpses disappear. So while playing football with the ragdolls used to be the preferred method, in the remake you'll probably want to knock them down while they're still alive. My second episode was about the 6-axis motion inputs for gestures, and what made them so awkward. Well, that's one mechanic that didn't survive, as the motion inputs are now missing. Gestures can be accessed through the menu brought up by the touchpad button, but also, just like the original, you can skip this by simply holding the X button for a few seconds. It'll directly bring up the list of gestures like before, the only difference being that holding X and waving your controller around doesn't do anything. Oh, and also there's a ton more gestures now, and some of them are hilarious. Okay, now that I've brought the series up to speed with the remake, the subject for today's episode is multiplayer level ranges. Now, I've worked on solving a whole bunch of ranges across the series, so don't worry, this video isn't going to just be a bunch of math. The goal here is to provide some insight as to how this all fits within the context of the Soulsborne games. And for the equations that we do go over, I promise it won't be too complicated. If you did prefer a TLDR, I've written the online matchmaking page for Wikidot, which lists all the ranges out, so you can always read that. And also, my friend Mopquill recently updated his level range calculator. So if you simply wanted to know who you can pair with without having to think about it too much, that's even better than the wiki. It shows all perspectives for all types of multiplayer. Okay, with that all being said, let's get started. Being the first Souls game, Demon Souls set a matchmaking precedent that's been reused several times. We can think of it as the series' standard co-op range, which is commonly known as the 10 plus 10% formula. You needed to be within a certain soul level range of another player to engage in multiplayer, and this is what governs what's allowed. There are a couple instances where it wasn't used. Dark Souls 2 abandoned level ranges entirely, and instead used a system called soul memory. While Bloodborne went back to traditional level ranges, but just happened to use a different and much wider range. But 10 plus 10% gets used in the rest of the games, and it was originally created for Demon Souls. The basic idea is pretty simple. To calculate a level range, just add and subtract 10 plus 10% of that level. For example, let's calculate the range for a level 100 player. So we can start by asking ourselves, what's 10% of 100? Well, that's pretty easy, it's just 10. So 10 plus 10 over here in the parentheses gives us a total of 20. So from our starting level of 100, we simply add and subtract 20 to get a range of 80 through 120. If you've been around in the Souls community for a while, you've probably seen at some point players recommending other players to be within 10 levels of their co-op partner. This was always a shorthand way of talking about this range. By eliminating the 10% part, it was a little less messy to discuss over forums. So if you've ever read the recommendation to be within 10 levels of your friend, that's where this comes from. It was never actually that restricted, and it was always at least 10 levels, plus some additional amount that scales with your level. If you're newer to the Souls community, you're probably less likely to have seen people ask about the exact level ranges, since the introduction of passwords that bypass the level range restrictions have allowed you to stop worrying if you'd be able to summon a friend or not. And the password system was included for the Demon's Souls remake as well, which is great to finally have here. So the 10 plus 10% formula is something that was understood by the community early on. The wiki had a calculator embedded into it, and when Dark Souls came out, we expected it to have the same range again, and it did. Sort of. Here's something to consider. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 1 Remastered all use the 10 plus 10% formula for their co-op range. But in Demon's Souls, the highest level a level 59 host can summon for help is 74. In the original version of Dark Souls, they could summon up to level 76 instead. And in Dark Souls Remastered, they could summon up to level 75. So all three games here are ostensibly using the same formula, but what kind of formula can keep getting different results? As always, the devil is in the details. It comes down to two things that aren't always guaranteed to work the same across the different games, which are perspective and rounding. Let's start with perspective. I talked about this briefly in my Soul Memory video, but I'll give a refresher here. Using level 100 as an easy example again, remember that 10 plus 10% worked out as a range of plus or minus 20, allowing level 100 to reach down to a level 80 player. So right now this formula is telling us a level 80 player and a level 100 player can match. So if anyone following along is quick with the math here, they might have already noticed an issue. Let's do the math again, but from level 80. When we do the calculation again, 10% of 80 is just 8. Add the 10 to that to get 18, so this time we're doing plus or minus 18 instead of plus or minus 20. This gives us a range that says that level 80 can pair up to level 98 at the highest. We had one calculation that said level 100 could pair with level 80, and then we have another calculation that says level 100 is too high and beyond the range for level 80. Which one is correct? Well, the question we need to ask is who is actually doing the calculation at any given moment, which informs us of the formula's perspective. Another way to think of it is that the two players aren't actually looking for each other. In Demon's Souls, it was the host who did the calculation, not the player using the Blue Eye Stone. So a level 100 host would do the math, and it would neatly give them a range of co-op phantoms who could be levels 80 through 120. That's simple enough, but in Dark Souls 1, this perspective was inverted. Hosts no longer calculated the level range, it was instead calculated by the person using their multiplayer item. So the answer is a lot messier. A level 100 host could now summon phantoms who were 82 through 122. Again, this is because you're not doing the math at all from the host's level, you're checking from the perspective of the person who placed the summon sign, and it's levels 82 and 122 who can reach up or down to 100, respectively. So if you were using the calculator for Demon's Souls, in order for it to be accurate for the original version of Dark Souls 1, you just have to swap the answers around across the two columns in order for it to be accurate. Dark Souls Remastered, on the other hand, flipped this perspective around again. Instead of working like the original Dark Souls, it moved things to being calculated by the host, just like in Demon's Souls. But remembering that example I showed earlier, we got 3 different answers for who a level 59 host could summon at the highest. So the Dark Souls Remaster should be working like Demon's Souls, yet it's still somehow doing its own thing and requiring, yet again, its own calculator. This is because of how it handled rounding differently. In the easy example of 100, we didn't have to worry about it. 10% of 100 is exactly 10. But of course, you can see how the 10% part of the formula could produce decimals. Like with my example of level 59, what exactly is 10% of 59? The answer of 5.9 isn't going to play nicely here because the level ranges can only be whole numbers, of course. There's no such thing as 0.9 of a soul level. In the case of both Demon's Souls and the original Dark Souls 1, you always round down right away. So from the outset you just delete the decimal entirely. There's no rounding up. So 10% of 59 is actually just 5. But for Dark Souls Remastered, it does round up to 6, which explains the different result. So we have 3 games here that all share the same formula for co-op, and yet they all handle it differently. When early reports came in that it looked like they kept the same co-op range for the Demon's Souls remake, of course the first thing I was wondering was if it actually remained identical, or if it went through one of these small changes again. As it turns out, perspective and rounding do remain completely unchanged, so it is truly completely the same as the original here, and this part of the calculator didn't have to be updated. It might be worth noting that the community didn't really understand the finer details of these calculations back in the day. I would love to show what the Wikidot calculator originally looked like, but the link for the old one is long dead. Just know that it didn't account for perspective, and this resulted in the calculator making something of a ballpark guess. And this did have some downstream effects. When Dark Souls 1 came out, a lot of people convinced themselves that it might have had an expanded range for co-op, perhaps something like a 10 plus 15% formula, because instances of summoning a little beyond what the previous calculator showed were being found. This didn't turn out to be the case, it was just a result of people not fully understanding what was happening in Demon Souls, and how a different perspective needed to be accounted for. One of my first big contributions to the Souls community was testing and figuring out exact level ranges for Dark Souls 1, and also figuring out soul memory for Dark Souls 2 when that came out. All the meanwhile, no one had ever gone back to look more closely at Demon Souls. It wasn't until shortly before Bloodborne came out that I returned to Demon Souls, so it's been a good 6 to 7 years out from its release, with all of the exact ranges being a mystery. Now you might be thinking that's not too surprising, it was just minor details that needed to be ironed out. But that's only true for co-op. That whole time, you couldn't find any information about the invasion ranges. So you might have noticed that the calculator puts the Blue Eye Stone and the Red Eye Stone together. The Red Eye Stone is an item that is used to summon players for consensual PvP, and that does share the same 10 plus 10% formula. Its range was understood to be the same back in the day, but there are 3 different kinds of PvP, and you wouldn't even find any guesses or ideas as to what the other 2 might have. In hunting down old discussion about it, I found some examples of people saying that the Black Eye Stone was unreliable and the Red Eye Stone should be used instead. We now know that any confusion was caused by different ranges being used that were unknown back then. Let's start with the Black Eye Stone. This is your equivalent to the Red Eye Orb of the Dark Souls games. It's what's used for standard invasions. I could go on a whole tangent about the Red Eye Orb's implementation throughout the Dark Souls games, but the general idea is that it allowed the invader to invade a little below their own level, or significantly higher above. This, of course, makes sense. The idea is to protect hosts from having invaders being a much higher level than them. It still doesn't prevent invaders from being overpowered, but it's like the bare minimum consideration for matchmaking, and you can see why they did it. We can see that this idea originated in Demon Souls, but its calculation was a lot less elegant than what Dark Souls 1 had. Here's what it looked like. And an example level range would be that a level 100 host could be invaded by levels 78 through 98. Okay, so this is probably going to look like noise to a lot of viewers, so don't worry if you haven't followed along with the numbers on the screen. We can reverse engineer the thought process of the developers here to understand the bigger picture. Like Dark Souls 1, it is a lopsided range that gives a level benefit to the host. They took the co-op range formula and chopped it in half. They didn't want invaders to be a higher level than the host, so they took their other formula, cut it exactly in half, and said invaders could only be in the bottom half of that range, invading up to the host. You might have noticed some weird numbers in there, like 12 and 2, but let's put those on the back burner for a second. For co-op, the range of available phantoms for a level 100 host, once again, was levels 80 through 120. We just cut off anything going above the host entirely, and it's this range of players who can invade the host, players 80 through 100. So you get the general idea of what they're going for, but it gets a little weirder. The developers must have wanted to nudge things just a little further in favor of the host, so for whatever reason they offset this entire range by exactly 2 levels. So you take the downwards portion of the co-op range and subtract 2 levels from the entire thing. Meaning it's not really levels 80 through 100 that can invade a level 100 host, it's 78 through 98. This has a really strange artifact in that the invader couldn't even be the exact same level as the host. At most, they could be a couple levels lower. So for anyone playing at the PvP meta, which was typically soul level 120 back in the day, they would have had to have been soul level 118 if they wanted to be able to invade a fight club using the Black Eye Stone. This is why the old wisdom of the Black Eye Stone being unreliable was a thing, because it was failing to invade hosts of the same level, and that was unexpected. This also has another interesting effect. If the invader has to be at least 2 levels lower than the host, What happens if the host is level 1, or level 2 for that matter? As it turns out, the game doesn't floor the invasion range, it does want to try and find a level that is 2 levels lower than these levels, which doesn't exist. This means it is impossible to be invaded when you're level 1 or 2 in Demon Souls. If you've ever wondered if it's possible to co-op with a friend in a Souls game without having to worry about the risk of invasions, here's how you can do it. Pick the royalty class in Demon Souls, the only one that starts at soul level 1, and don't level up. Well, you do technically have 1 point you can spend, so you might consider putting 1 point into strength to unlock some more options for weapons. But yeah, just stay under level 3 and you won't ever get invaded in Demon Souls.
Soul of the lost, withdrawn from its vessel.
Okay, I realize this is probably not the solution anyone wanted. If you're concerned about invasions, doing a low-level challenge run is probably not what you had in mind. But if more people understand this, I hope it inspires at least someone to try. I know some people in the comments are going to say things like,
"What's the point in doing the challenge run if you're just going to get help doing it?"
But remember that it's up to you to decide what's most fun for you. I could see some players being more interested in a Soul Level 1 playthrough if they get to share that misery with a friend, and the lack of invasions should hopefully be enticing. Now, the Black Eye Stone did have its range updated for the remake, so this is the one aspect that is different now. They took the exact same formula as before, but tacked plus 10% back onto the end of the upper level limit. So we previously had the range of 78 through 98, being able to invade a level 100 host. We take that previous cap of 98, add 10% of 100 back onto it, meaning the invasion range in the remake for level 100 is levels 78 through 108 instead. Again, this is the only level range that was altered for the remake. This is a pretty small change, but it's also an unambiguous improvement with essentially zero downsides, in my opinion. It means that the invader can now be the same level as the host, and a little higher in most cases. So the previous issue of needing to be 2 levels lower, and how that might complicate things for fight clubs and community events, that problem has been solved and is no longer an issue. The calculator also splits things up in a way that's easy to read, so there shouldn't be any confusion which version of the game you're looking up. Now, you might say, if the original intention was for invaders to be a lower level than the host, doesn't widening the level range for the invaders unfairly nudge things further in their favor? I suppose, technically, yes, but in reality, no. Not enough to matter. Again, it's not a massive change to the level range, and the issue of what allows twinking lies elsewhere. Invaders could potentially already be very overpowered compared to the host, so giving them a few extra levels to work with is very unlikely to make the difference in what makes an invasion feel fair or unfair. So this is a quality of life improvement. It'll make finding multiplayer activity a bit easier, and that's what matters most. I should clarify that, despite having a new and improved invasion range, it's still possible to avoid invasions if you stay level 1 or 2. This is because the new formula produces the exact same range as before for hosts who are between the levels of 1 through 9. Why is this? Remember how rounding works. It always rounds down for the level range calculations in Demon Souls, so the 10% part of the formula for anything under level 10 is going to be 0 point something, which just turns into 0. So adding 10% back onto the end of the range does nothing. So it is still true that at the lowest levels, the invader has to be 2 levels lower, and what you see is that every 10 levels, you essentially hit a new tier that dictates a new level relationship between the highest possible invader and the host. So for hosts levels 1 through 9, the invader can only be 2 levels lower than the host. From levels 10 through 19, the invader can be 1 level lower. At level 20, they can be the same level. At level 30, they can be 1 level higher. At level 40, the invader can be 2 levels higher now, and so forth. The Old Monk in Demon Souls is a bit interesting in that it doesn't use its own multiplayer item. Players using any of the 3 multiplayer items in Latria, the Blue Eye Stone, the Red Eye Stone, or the Black Eye Stone, can have their multiplayer attempts hijacked. This is just like the Looking Glass Knight from Dark Souls 2, only instead you get to play as the actual boss itself, and not just an additional summon. And just like the Looking Glass Knight, the Old Monk ignores the summoning ranges used by those other items, and uses its own. What's unique about the Old Monk level range is that, completely unlike any other level range across the Soulsborne titles, this one is a totally static range that doesn't scale in any way. There's no percentage part, so the math on this is really easy. The invader can be as low as exactly 40 levels below the host, or up to 10 above. So that's really all there is to it. It's a simple span of 50 levels, 40 below and 10 above the host. It's a generous span of levels that makes it very easy to get summoned as the Old Monk as long as you're anywhere remotely in the ballpark of being low to mid-level. Just remember that you can't get summoned very far below your own level as the invader, so you probably want to lean towards the lower end of things if you're trying to become the Old Monk as frequently as possible. For example, a level 40 invader could invade levels 30 through 80, so that would easily cover the vast majority of players encountering the Old Monk. Not a lot of people are going to be much higher or lower than that when they get there.
No, God!
One thing to bear in mind is that my previous advice of staying level 1 to avoid PvP won't work for the Old Monk. That applied to Black Eye Stone invasions throughout the rest of the game, but this is one place where the potential for PvP is unavoidable. Anyone up to level 11 can become the Old Monk for a level 1 host. But obviously, that's something you can worry about much less. It's just one specific part of the game, and if someone's looking for multiplayer activity that low in Latria, there's a good chance it's probably just Emporsol trying to get summoned for co-op in the first area. So they might be caught off guard and not well prepared for PvP anyways. So, as I mentioned earlier, password matchmaking was introduced to the remake, which bypasses level ranges for both co-op and red sign summons. So if you're using the Blue Eye Stone or Red Eye Stone, you can co-op or PvP with a friend without any regard for level range restrictions, so long as you match a password in the network settings. The password doesn't work for random invasions or Old Monk Summons, however, but do note that if you're trying to invade a friend this way, I find that it's really not that hard to pull off. You might invade or prioritize some other random players who have less ping with you first, but with a bit of persistence, it's not at all impossible just because a password isn't linking you up. Something that the game doesn't make clear, though, is that setting a password can still help with random invasions. The reason for this is a bit odd, but basically, setting a password allows someone to host multiplayer activity after their boss has been defeated. This is a new feature for the remake, and it's pretty cool. Want to revisit an area and bring a friend along to collect some item you missed? Or summon someone for PvP inside a boss arena? You can do that by coordinating a password. As of the most recent patch, passwords no longer target or match invasions for the Black Eye Stone, but the host simply having a password on at all turns multiplayer back on and opens them up to random invasions as well. I can't stress this enough because a lot of people still seem confused by it, wondering when the game will or won't allow invasions after the boss is dead. It comes down to one thing only, and that's whether or not the host has a password turned on. It can be literally anything at all, because the random invader doesn't need to know or match that password in any way. It does nothing for the Black Eye Stone itself, it simply opens up multiplayer for the host. Okay, so for the next point of discussion. The information in this video should be accurate as of the most recent patch, but keep an eye out for a pinned comment below should anything change or be discovered. I do consider it very unlikely for any of the level ranges themselves to get patched, however. It's just a gut feeling, but because of how they're mostly identical to the original, and the one small change they did make isn't controversial, there's no indication that anything needs to be changed. But you can never be sure. That being said, I do think a tangential mistake might have been made with the most recent patch. Invading Phantoms have stopped dropping souls when defeated in PvP, which is really weird. It's hard to say for sure what's happening, but maybe they were worried hosts were going to cheese PvP for soul farming in some way. But it existed in both the original version of the game and up until the most recent patch in the remake, so it's a really strange thing to take away. And by the way, they haven't been releasing any patch notes at all, which is incredibly ridiculous, so we don't know what's a bug or what's intended. So that about wraps things up. Special thanks to Hollow Invasion for putting in a bunch of hours helping me test the level ranges. They were my primary help for testing things in the remake, and it's super appreciated. And also to Mopquill for making and updating their calculators. Additional thanks to Dang It Jim for further testing help, and to everyone who helped me test the original ranges all those years back. Krasnoya Ronin, Romanticore, and Stockpile Tom. I would like to take a moment to introduce the Dark Souls Screensavers series. This was kind of a silly idea, but after gathering various environmental shots for previous videos, I thought there would be some novelty in making an entire video of just that. My first episode was recently launched after hitting a Patreon goal for it, and it's publicly available right now, so you can enjoy an hour-long video that's entirely of Sen's Fortress. It's kind of a niche thing, but I feel like somebody out there will enjoy putting it on in the background, and whoever you are, I hope you enjoy it. All episodes will be added to a playlist that's linked below. More episodes will be made as further goals for my Patreon, and polls will be held to decide which areas are done next. Thank you to all of my supporters, any amount helps. Backers at the Evil Vagrant tier include Alex the Bear, Astranicus, Curtis Ware, Gary Marshall, Harry Pham, Jamie Schirmer, Carl Germ, Nashwan Azari, Pethris, Stuart Rice, The Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thanks again for watching.